The most powerful economic voice in post-war Britain destroyed his own career in less than 30 seconds. Not with a scandalous affair, not with a bag of stolen money, with a whisper in a corridor, a careless hint to a journalist, just hours before he was due to present the most important budget in Europe, would topple Hugh Dalton. From the height of power in hand, a crucial victory to his rivals. That moment of almost casual self-destruction made him a cautionary tale in Westminster for decades. But the man who could not keep one secret had spent a lifetime forcing open the secrets of class, privilege, and power. To understand how a quiet, awkward boy became the architect of Britain's post-war economy, and then blew it all up, we have to go back, long before the budget, long before the headlines, to a childhood lived in the shadow of a castle. Because Hugh Dalton's story begins in a place that should have guaranteed he would end up as everything he eventually fought against. He was born on 26th of August 1887, not in some smoky industrial town, but in Neath, a small town in South Wales. His father, John Neil Dalton, was no miner or railwayman. He was a priest, and not just any priest. He would become canon of St. George's Chapel, Windsor, and chaplain to Queen Victoria and later to King Edward VII. His job was to comfort monarchs, advise princes, move easily through polished corridors of absolute confidence. Hugh's earliest clear memories were carved against the grey stone of Windsor Castle. Imagine it, a thin, serious boy, standing in a courtyard where guards in bright red tunics change shift with perfect precision, where carriages roll past on gravel, where servants step aside for royalty. On Sundays, his father preached under vaulted ceilings to a congregation glittering with orders and medals, the kind of people who believed, honestly, that the world had been designed around them. In that world, the path for a boy like Hugh was pre-written. Eton, Oxbridge, the bar, a safe seat as a Conservative MP, a smooth ascent through a system that loved nothing more than reproducing itself. And yet, from the beginning, something in him chafed. He grew up between two kinds of sermons. At home, his father's world spoke a language of duty and hierarchy. The Queen, then the Lords, then the gentlemen, then, somewhere far below, the rest. But outside the castle walls, Britain was changing. Newspapers carried stories of the Boer War, of soldiers dying in dusty South African fields, of scandals about the way the poor were treated in the cities that fed the empire. Hugh read them hungrily. He would look up from a column describing half-starved recruits rejected for military service, and through the window he could see the royal standard flapping calmly in the breeze over the castle towers. That contrast sank deep. At school he was tall, slightly gangling, with a wary, sharp face and intense eyes. He was not a golden boy. He was not the handsome captain everyone wanted to follow. He was the stubborn one at the back of the room who kept asking, why should they have more than everyone else? Eton tried to polish him into shape. He arrived at the college that had manufactured generations of British rulers, a place where the sons of dukes and bankers learned how to sound modest while assuming they would one day govern millions of people they would never meet. The uniforms were immaculate. The jokes were cruel. The rules were unspoken but rigid. If you were smart, you learned when to laugh and when to shut up. Hugh struggled with that part. He learned Latin and Greek, history and mathematics, but what excited him was argument. In the debating society, he discovered a kind of power he could respect. Not inherited from a title or bought with land, but demanded by the force of ideas. He wasn't the funniest speaker, but he was relentless. If you gave him a contradiction, he wouldn't let it go. Imagine a tall, slightly awkward teenager facing a line of polished young aristocrats and quietly taking their beliefs apart, piece by piece. While others treated politics as a game, Hugh treated it as a wound that needed inspecting, even if it hurt. The more he saw of the casual waste of privilege, the way some boys treated servants as furniture, the way money softened every blow, the more something hardened inside him. He didn't become a revolutionary overnight, but the idea that the world might be organized on a different basis lodged in his mind and refused to leave. By the time he moved on to King's College, Cambridge, the Edwardian calm was already cracking. At Cambridge, he stepped into a world buzzing with new ideas. On the banks of the Cam, under soft English skies, students argued about Nietzsche and socialism, about the coming great power conflict, about whether the old order could survive. Hugh studied history, digging into the slow, brutal processes by which empires rose and fell. He saw how often noble words had covered up ignoble motives. The more he read, the less convinced he was that Britain's apparent stability had any claim to moral superiority. And then he found his tribe. In dimly lit rooms, over weak tea and strong opinions, he began to attend meetings of the Fabian Society, a group of gradualist socialists who believed capitalism could be replaced not by a single revolution, but by steady, intelligent pressure, by policy, by patience. It was the perfect home for a man who believed in argument as weapon and timetable as strategy. These weren't bomb throwers. They were chart drawers. They wrote pamphlets with titles like The Abolition of Poor Law and National Minimum. Dry words, shaking foundations. Hugh listened to them talk about public ownership of industry, progressive taxation, the welfare state, long before those phrases would enter national politics. Something clicked. Here, at last, was a language that matched the anger he felt at seeing rich boys breeze through life while others struggled. Still, there was a problem. A tall, ex-Etonian son of a royal chaplain talking about socialism sounds, at first, like a joke. His accent, his background, his clothes, everything about him screamed establishment. At early meetings, some workers eyed him with open suspicion, assuming he must be a spy or at least a tourist. He decided the only way to overcome that was to be better prepared than anyone else in the room. He trained himself to master details, tax systems, wage structures, the price of bread in different parts of London. While other young men drifted through smoky debates, Hugh was making notes, turning outrage into spreadsheets long before spreadsheets existed. He understood that if you wanted to defeat an entrenched class, you had to know more than they did, not just shout louder. At Cambridge, he discovered another, more personal kind of rivalry, too. He watched how easily some people charmed their way through. The golden tongues, the natural leaders, the ones whose jokes landed, while his labored arguments sometimes drew only polite coughs. He learned a hard truth. Being right was not enough. You also had to be heard. He left Cambridge with a degree and a conviction that he wouldn't spend his life in quiet academic comfort. But he did not go straight into politics. He needed tools, and he knew it. He went to the London School of Economics, then still young and intensely political, a place where economics was taught not as a neutral science, but as a battlefield. There, the Fabian influence deepened. He listened to lectures that treated budgets as moral documents and trade policies as instruments of class war. He began to see the state not as something that simply was, but as a machine that could be redesigned. Then, Europe exploded. In 1914, the continent he had studied in history books lurched into war. The August sun shone on cheering crowds as young men volunteered, imagining glory. Hugh faced a choice that would tear at many of his generation. Stay in London, building arguments on chalkboards, or go to the front, where arguments were reduced to shrapnel and mud. He volunteered. Commissioned into the Royal Artillery, the intellectual with the neatly organized notebooks found himself learning how to calculate angles of fire, not income distribution. On the Western Front, he saw the industrial slaughter of modern war at its most obscene. Men torn apart by shells, faces burned by gas, bodies left in shell holes that filled slowly with rain. Later, when he wrote his war memoir, With British Guns in Italy, the words struggled to keep up with the images. In northern Italy on the Asiago Plateau, British guns thundered in support of Italian troops. Snow, wire, explosions. And somewhere in the midst of it, Major Hugh Dalton, the Fabian socialist, trying to reconcile the arithmetic of artillery with the human beings it obliterated. The war did two things to him. It hardened his hatred of German militarism and of appeasement, a fury that would later bring him into direct conflict with more cautious politicians, and it convinced him that the old order had forfeited its right to rule. If the same class that had run the empire had also marched a generation into the meat grinder, why should anyone trust them with peace? Demobilized after the war, he returned to London with medals on his chest and ghosts in his head. He went back to the LSE as a lecturer in economics and public finance. In the classroom, he was rigorous, sometimes caustic, with a soldier's impatience for woolly thinking. Students remembered his tall figure pacing, chalk in hand, slashing through bad arguments as if they were enemy positions. He began to write seriously on the control of industry, on taxation, on how the state could plan an economy instead of letting markets stumble blindly from boom to bust. These were not abstract exercises. He had learned in the trenches that bad policy meant dead men. Somewhere in these years, in lecture halls and committee rooms, he met Ruth Fox. Ruth was clever, politically committed, and anything but a decorative appendage. The daughter of a Jewish businessman, she was active in the labor movement in her own right, a feminist in an era when that word was barely tolerated in polite society. They married in 1914, just as Europe was going up in flames. Their partnership would be one of argument and loyalty, of long evenings spent plotting campaigns and reading draft speeches. They would endure a private tragedy that marked them both: the loss of their only child in infancy. Grief, for Hugh, did not show as tears in public. It showed as a tightening, a resolve that the world must somehow be made less cruel, that suffering should at least be productive. It added a sharper edge to his belief that the state had a duty to protect the vulnerable. By the early 1920s, Hugh Dalton had all the pieces of a political weapon: a first-class brain, a network in labor's intellectual circles, a war record that no one could sneer at, and a burning conviction that Britain needed a new kind of government. What he did not have was a seat in Parliament, and time, he felt, was already against him. Post-war Britain was in turmoil. Unemployment climbed, factories stood idle, returning soldiers found no work. The old Liberal Party was collapsing. The Labour Party was rising, but unsure of itself, caught between revolutionary rhetoric and practical reform. If he did not get into the House of Commons in these years, when everything was in motion, he feared he might miss the moment entirely. He would be left on the lecture circuit, writing books that ministers glanced at and forgot. So he began the long, humiliating apprenticeship of every aspiring MP, fighting unwinnable seats. In the 1922 general election, he stood as a Labour candidate in a constituency where the Conservative vote seemed carved into stone. Local party members were hopeful but realistic. "We need to show the flag," they said. "We know we won't win." To Hugh, that language sounded dangerously like defeat. He threw himself into the campaign with military intensity. Early mornings in drafty church halls, nights spent on doorsteps listening to stories of rent arrears and lost jobs, afternoons at factory gates handing out leaflets that people used to wrap their sandwiches. His main opponent, a sitting Conservative, comfortable and confident, treated him like an amusing curiosity. A socialist with an Eton background was, to him, a contradiction in terms, a phase the young man would soon grow out of. At hustings, the Tories smiled indulgently as Hugh rattled off statistics about unemployment and income distribution, then soothed the crowd with jokes and promises that nothing too drastic would change. Polling day arrived like a deadline in slow motion. Ballot boxes were collected, sealed, and driven to the town hall. Hugh watched the count, cigarette after cigarette burning down between his fingers. Each bundle of Conservative votes was a reminder of how much the system resisted his message. The result was not even close. He lost heavily. The count was brutal in its simplicity. Hundreds more crosses for his rival, a rejected argument written in black pencil. To return to London, to LSE, after that, was to feel the weight of failure in every polite greeting. Colleagues consoled him. You were never expected to win. But he had not stood to be expected to lose. He tried again in 1923, in another tough seat, under another tight campaign. This time the margin narrowed. His speeches were sharper, his timing better, his feel for what moved a crowd more instinctive. He began to understand that abstract talk of public ownership meant little to a man whose immediate problem was Wednesday's rent. He talked less about theory and more about security. Food on the table, jobs that wouldn't vanish in the next slump, a government that would not send their sons to die for vague promises. He spoke of using the power of the state the way an artillery officer used his guns, deliberately, with careful aim, to change the landscape. Still, he lost. 2 defeats in a row would have persuaded many to retreat back to academic life, to tell themselves that they could influence policy, through advice rather than votes. But Hugh had seen up close what it meant to depend on the goodwill of those in power. He was done with that. Somewhere else, in Oxford, a quieter drama was beginning. A younger man, Hugh Gaitskell, was studying classics and philosophy, dabbling in economics, absorbing the same turbulence of the age from a different angle. Dalton had never heard his name, not yet. But the two men's paths were already bending toward each other. One day, Gaitskell would be his brightest pupil, his natural successor, and his bitter rival. The clock of history does not tick loudly, but Hugh felt it all the same. Another general election was coming, and with it, what might be his last real chance to storm the gates. In 1924, the Labour Party found itself in a strange new position. Not just an opposition voice, but the party of government, if only briefly and precariously. Ramsay MacDonald's minority government needed every serious brain it could get. For Hugh, that meant only one thing. He had to be in the House of Commons when the music stopped. A local party in South London, Peckham, selected him as their candidate. It was hardly a gift. The area was a rough mix of small workshops and crowded streets. The seat was far from safe, and the Conservative machine was well-oiled. To make matters worse, the campaign period was brutally short. In a matter of weeks, he would either be an MP or once again a defeated candidate, a talented man written off as electorally toxic, a deadline sharp enough to cut. He campaigned like a man who knew that dawn meetings at tram depots, arguments in smoky pubs where men's hands still showed the grime of the day's labor, speeches in rain, slicked streets under flickering gas lamps. He talked about his war record, not to boast, but to make it clear he knew what their sons had faced. He attacked the Conservatives as the party that had been happy to send them to war and now seemed strangely relaxed about leaving them jobless in peace. His Conservative opponent had money, organization, and the reassuring manner of someone who looked like every other MP the area had ever had. He spoke about stability, confidence, gradual recovery. He laughed off the idea that a Labour government could run a modern economy without disaster. Every leaflet, every doorstep, every handshake became part of the countdown. There was no second round, no extra time, only polling day and then judgment. On the final night before the vote, exhausted, voice shredded, Hugh addressed one last packed meeting in a cramped hall. The air was thick with tobacco smoke and damp wool. He told them bluntly that if they wanted the same people who had created the mess to go on running the country, they knew how to vote. If they wanted something different, they had for the first time a real choice. Then the day came. Ballot papers dropped into boxes with soft thuds that sounded, to him, like the ticking of a bomb. When the polls closed, he followed the boxes to the count. The same long process he had endured twice before, now with his entire future hanging on the piles of paper growing on trestle tables. At first, it looked like a repeat performance. The Conservative stack solid, his own worryingly thin. But as the night wore on, something changed. Street by street, district by district, the pattern shifted. The new estates with their rows of tiny houses, the streets with the highest number of unemployed men, the wards where his relentless canvassing had turned curious listeners into determined supporters. The gap narrowed. Then, for the first time, his pile of votes edged ahead. Recounts were demanded, objections raised. For over an hour, the room was a blur of muttered arguments and rustling paper. In one corner, the Conservative agent was already thinking about a legal challenge. In another, Ruth, pale with fatigue, watched the arithmetic dance on the edge of reversal. Finally, the returning officer climbed to the platform with a slip of paper in his hand. The hall quietened. The numbers landed like hammer blows. Hugh Dalton, elected member of Parliament. The tall, awkward son of the Queen's chaplain, the ex-Etonian, the artillery officer turned economist, had done something almost no one in his world had predicted. He had entered the House of Commons not as a Conservative, not as a Liberal, but as a Labour socialist sworn to reshape the very system that had raised him. As he walked through the heavy doors of the Palace of Westminster for the first time as an MP, under the ticking gaze of the great clock in the tower, a new countdown began. To budgets, to battles, to enemies he could see and those he could not yet imagine, including the rival whose quiet rise would one day collide with his own. For now, though, Hugh Dalton had made it inside. The boy in the shadow of Windsor Castle had infiltrated the citadel. The real fight was about to start. Winning a seat in Parliament, Hugh discovered, is like finally forcing open a locked door, only to find another door behind it. And behind that, a maze, crowded with men who already know the shortcuts. He walked into the Palace of Westminster in 1924 with the zeal of a crusader and the status of a rookie. The carpets were thick, the voices smooth, the jokes inside. The chamber itself felt like a theater designed to intimidate. High green benches, the echo of centuries in every shout of order. The front benches already claimed by men who carried cabinet pedigree like a second skin. He took his place on the back benches, just one Labour MP among many. No red box, no department, no civil servants waiting for his signature. After all those years of study, war, defeat, and struggle, his only official weapon was his voice. And even that, at first, misfired. In his maiden speech, the tall, serious figure with the careful diction rose from the Labour benches and began to talk about unemployment and inequality with an academic's precision. Some listened. Many did not. A few Conservatives actually turned their backs, chatting among themselves, as if the very sound of his argument were an inconvenience. From the press gallery, The verdicts were polite but cold. Able, well-informed, heavy, not the kind of adjectives that move crowds. He realized, in that smoky chamber, that Parliament rewarded not just knowledge but timing, theater, and cruelty. The House loved a cutting phrase more than a well-constructed graph. The men who mattered could skewer an opponent with a single joke and erase 3 weeks of careful research. So he adapted. He watched the great performers, Winston Churchill on one side of the House, Ramsay MacDonald on the other, and learned where to plant a phrase so it would explode at exactly the right moment. He sharpened his sentences, cut the padding, learned to land a statistic like a punch. If he could not be the funniest man in the room, he could at least be the one who knew exactly how much each policy would cost. Outside the chamber, in committee rooms and party meetings, his influence grew faster. There, detail mattered. There, the labor leadership needed someone who could translate moral outrage into numbers that would survive Treasury scrutiny. Hugh Dalton, the ex-artillery officer, began to map out fiscal bombardments on pieces of notepaper. But political time moves brutally fast. Within months of his arrival, a general election swept away the brief hope of labor in government. The conservative landslide of 1924 slammed the door on office. Hugh, still an obscure backbencher, had no record to defend, no ministerial career to mourn. But he could feel something slipping. The chance to shape policy from inside, not just criticize it from across the aisle. He responded the only way he knew how, by working harder. He joined labor committees, wrote pamphlets, and positioned himself as the party's specialist in finance and foreign affairs. In evenings, returning to a modest flat rather than a grand club, he would pore over Treasury reports until the figures blurred. The more he learned, the more he understood just how much power was concentrated in the office he really wanted, the one he hardly dared name aloud yet. Chancellor of the Exchequer. It was a long way up from the back row to that red box. The break came with the 1929 election, a fragile economic boom, a divided Conservative Party, and a labor message of cautious hope combined to tilt the balance. Ramsay MacDonald returned to Downing Street, this time at the head of a second Labour government, larger and more confident. Hugh, re-elected now for Bishop Auckland after losing Peckham, waited to see if his years of work had been noticed. They had. He was summoned, not to the Treasury, but to the Foreign Office, appointed Under-Secretary of State under Arthur Henderson. It was junior office, yes, but it was office. A foot, finally, on the inside of the cabinet table. He threw himself into the job. League of Nations debates, disarmament conferences, tangled negotiations over war debts and reparations. In Geneva, he watched representatives of powers that had bled each other white stand up and solemnly promise never again. Then, return home to cut unemployment benefits and flirt with dictators. He grew more radical, not less. Then, in October 1929, Wall Street broke. News of the crash flashed across the cables. A cascade of falling prices, ruined fortunes, shuttered banks. The numbers on the ticker tape translated, slowly and cruelly, into empty docks on the Tyne and silent mills in Lancashire. World trade shrank. British exports plunged. The country slipped into the diseased rhythm of mass unemployment. Monday, queue at the labor exchange. Tuesday, pawn what's left. Wednesday, borrow. Thursday, go hungry. Inside the cabinet, panic whispered. Officials insisted on sound finance. The orthodoxy said that in a crisis, a government must cut spending, balance the budget, and reassure the markets, even if it meant slashing benefits just when people needed them most. To Hugh, that sounded like sending in fewer doctors because the hospital was full. He argued, again and again, for a different course. Borrowing to create jobs, public works to restart demand, a deliberate use of the state to break the vicious circle. But he was only an undersecretary. The great decisions were made in a small, increasingly secretive ring around MacDonald. And in that ring, another clever lawyer-economist was beginning to orbit. Stafford Cripps. Cripps, with his sharp features and even sharper intellect, had moved into Parliament from the world of high law on a tide of admiration from the left. Unlike Dalton, he had the kind of cold courtroom clarity that turned complex arguments into devastating speeches. He dazzled audiences, spoke faster, cut deeper. They were allies. At first, both men believed capitalism was failing. Both wanted a more planned economy, a stronger state. In late-night meetings, they sketched visions of nationalized banks and major industries, working not for shareholders but for the public. To many in Labour's rank and file, the pair looked like a future double act. Dalton, the meticulous planner, Cripps, the courtroom assassin. But politics is rarely kind to partnerships. In 1931, facing a terrifying deficit, Ramsay MacDonald chose what he called national duty, and others called betrayal. Instead of rallying Labour behind an alternative to cuts, he formed a national government with the Conservatives and a handful of loyalists, committing to slash unemployment benefit and public pay. In August, Hugh sat in a stunned parliamentary Labour Party meeting as MacDonald explained the decision. The air was thick with disbelief and fury. When the vote came, Hugh joined the majority in refusing to follow the Prime Minister into coalition with their oldest enemies. MacDonald walked out. The party split. The government fell to pieces and reassembled, grotesquely, with Tory hands on the controls and MacDonald as a trapped figurehead. Then came the election. The 1931 contest was a massacre. The national government appealed for national unity and courageous sacrifice. The press screamed about wreckers and irresponsibles. In working-class streets where Labour posters had once filled windows, fear did the rest. Hugh fought as if he were defending not just a seat, but a principle. That a Labour man did not cross the floor to join the class he was meant to oppose. Night after night he hammered the national government's contradictions, warning that cuts would deepen the slump, not cure it. The voters were not listening, or rather, they were listening to a louder, more coordinated, more terrifying chorus. On the night of the count, he watched the figures come in with a sick sense of déjà vu, and then something worse. This was not a narrow loss. This was a landslide in reverse. Labour grandees fell one by one. Constituency after constituency turned blue, or National Labour, yellow. Bishop Auckland went the same way. When the result was declared, Hugh stood on the platform, face set, as his Conservative opponent was cheered as the voice of reason and national recovery. He had been an Under-Secretary of State a month before. Now he was nothing. No office, no seat, no salary. Just a defeated candidate and a party cut down from government to a rump of 52 MPs. At 44, he felt his career being buried alive. The clocks in Westminster went on ticking without him. Committees met without him. The new Chancellor, Philip Snowdon, then Neville Chamberlain, would make decisions he had warned against while he watched from the visitors' gallery or read about them in the papers. Time and his rival moved on. Stafford Cripps kept his seat. From inside the tiny parliamentary Labour Party he rose quickly, speaking with icy authority, becoming the hero of those who wanted Labour to break decisively with constitutional gradualism and lean harder into class war. Hugh, outside, could only write, lecture, and attempt to shape the party's thinking from the margins. He refused to disappear. In a cramped study, often late into the night, he wrote books with titles that sounded dry but held dynamite. Practical Socialism. For Britain. The Inequality of Incomes. He attacked the national government's austerity, laid out plans for public ownership and planning, argued that full employment was not a fantasy but a technical task. He also sharpened another weapon, his pen in Labour's internal press. Week after week he flayed MacDonald as a traitor, Chamberlain as a blinkered accountant, and the economic orthodoxy as a religion. Of balanced books in a land of unbalanced lives, the party, licking its wounds, slowly began to swing his way. By 1935, with another election approaching, Labour needed candidates who could argue not just against the government, but for something. Hugh was adopted for Bishop Auckland again, this time facing a national government determined to hold the seat. He campaigned like a man racing a stopwatch only he could hear. If he could not get back into Parliament soon, others, younger, brasher, less scarred by 1931, would fill the space. Cripps was already being talked about, in some circles, as a future leader, perhaps even a future chancellor. The 1935 election improved Labour's fortunes, but not enough for him. He lost Bishop Auckland by a narrow margin, another defeat, another rejected argument. Yet fate and mortality intervened. The sitting MP died suddenly in 1936. A by-election was called. Hugh, reselected as candidate, had one more chance. One brief, brutal campaign. The Conservatives threw resources at the seat. So did he. Day after day, he burned through his voice and his reserves, promising the miners and laborers of County Durham that he would not desert them for fashion or favor. This time, when the votes were counted, the majority went his way. At last, he re-entered the House, not as the young hopeful of 1924, but as a battle-hardened survivor of labor's darkest decade. He returned to a different party. Ramsay MacDonald was gone, exiled by history. The new leader, Clement Attlee, was quiet, methodical, often underestimated, which suited him perfectly. Around Attlee, a new generation was forming. Herbert Morrison, the backroom genius of London politics. Ernest Bevin, the blunt, forceful trade union boss. And on the legal intellectual left, Stafford Cripps, now almost as talked about as Attlee himself. Hugh positioned himself close to the core. He joined Labour's National Executive Committee and became chair of the party's Economic and Financial Committee. On paper, this was an internal post. In practice, it meant designing the blueprint for whatever a future Labour government could do, if it ever got back to power. Outside, the world darkened. Hitler rearmed Germany. Mussolini bombed Ethiopia. The Spanish Republic bled under fascist assault. Neville Chamberlain, in Downing Street, offered a policy of appeasement, concessions, negotiations, paper promises, in the hope of avoiding another war. The Labour Party, still traumatized by 1914-18, was split. Many members, especially in the constituencies, were pacifists. They heard in Hugh's warnings about Hitler the first rumblings of another catastrophe. He argued anyway. He stood up at conference after conference and in Parliament, insisting that fascism could not be bought off with sympathetic words and scraps of paper. Rearmament, he said, was not warmongering but insurance. Better British factories making planes and guns now than British cities reduced to rubble later. Cripps took a different route. He pushed for a popular front, a grand alliance of Labour, Liberals, and even Communists to stop fascism at home and abroad. It was a bold strategy, but it alarmed many who saw communism as no better than fascism. Hugh thought it reckless, a distraction from building a disciplined Labour majority. Their rivalry, once polite, began to acquire edges. To some on the left, Cripps looked more heroic, willing to defy his own party for principle, far-sighted, dramatic. Dalton, with his committees and calculations, seemed almost pedestrian by comparison. Yet it was Dalton who was turning ideas into costed programs, who could reassure trade unionists that socialism did not mean economic chaos. The clock was running in a far more terrifying way now. In September 1938, Chamberlain flew to Munich and returned with a piece of paper and a phrase, "Peace for our time." Hugh listened to the broadcast in bitter silence. He was convinced it was an illusion purchased at Czechoslovakia's expense. Within a year, German tanks had rolled, and in September 1939, Britain was at war again. Parliament changed overnight. The chamber that had once dozed through economic debates now throbbed with urgency. Hugh, still a backbencher, supported the declaration of war without hesitation. For him, this was not another imperial adventure. This was a fight for survival against a regime that embodied everything he loathed. At first, the war went badly. The phony war gave way to disaster in Norway, the fall of France, the evacuation from Dunkirk. The national government under Chamberlain looked directionless, tired, unable to grasp the scale of the crisis. In May 1940, after a furious debate in which Hugh joined those attacking Chamberlain's conduct, the Prime Minister fell. Winston Churchill formed a coalition. To fight a total war, he needed Labour. Clement Attlee entered the War Cabinet. Ernest Bevin took charge of Labour and production. And Hugh Dalton, after 2 decades of shadowboxing with power, received the kind of job that would never have existed in peacetime. Minister of Economic Warfare. The title sounded bland. The reality was anything but. In an anonymous building, in rooms lined with maps and pinholes, he directed Britain's economic strangulation of the Axis. It was his task to make sure supplies to Germany and its satellites dried up, to organize blockades, to starve factories of raw materials, to use money and scarcity as weapons as lethal, in their slow way, as shells. Under his umbrella, another, even darker organization grew. The Special Operations Executive, tasked, in Churchill's words, to set Europe ablaze. Sabotage, subversion, resistance networks. Operations that might never be admitted publicly, but which relied on Dalton's department. For money, cover, and political protection, the quiet Fabian socialist, once mocked as bloodless, now signed off on missions that could end with agents hanging from piano wire in Gestapo cellars. He was both fascinated and appalled by the work. Fascinated, because here was state power at its most concentrated. Secret budgets, invisible battles, measurable results in tonnage, lost and factories destroyed. appalled. Because every success meant some group of unknown men and women risking their lives in shadows they would never leave. Meanwhile, his old rival Cripps had been sent to Moscow as ambassador, then brought back to run aircraft production. Two brilliant labor lawyers, on different fronts of the same war, each gathering experience, prestige, and, unspoken but real, claims to future power. Churchill, Attlee, Morrison, Bevan, Dalton, Cripps. They were not just fighting Hitler. They were, consciously or not, competing in a silent contest for the shape of post-war Britain. Hugh knew the war would end. The question was, with whose ideas ready on the table when it did? So, as German bombs fell and ration books were stamped, he worked on two timescales at once. By day, economic warfare. By night, on labor committees and in private papers, he sketched what a peace built on socialist principles would look like. He helped frame labor's commitment to full employment, to a national health service, to the public ownership of key industries. He argued that you could not ask men to fight and die for freedom, and then send them back to the same unemployment lines and slums they had left. Inside the war cabinet, he clashed at times with Churchill and the service chiefs, demanding more attention to long-term planning. He was no longer the awkward young backbencher being talked over. His voice, when he used it now, carried the weight of a minister whose decisions could tilt the war's balance. By 1942, Churchill moved him to another crucial post, President of the Board of Trade. There, Hugh controlled imports, exports, and the rationing system that touched every British kitchen table. Bread, clothing, fuel. He had a hand in how much, when, and to whom. It was at the Board of Trade that a new figure began to appear in his life. A younger economist named Hugh Gaitskell. Dalton spotted in Gaitskell a sharp mind and a capacity for hard, unglamorous work that reminded him, painfully, of his own younger self. He drew him into the department, gave him responsibility, mentored him. Together, they navigated the intricate dance between planning and scarcity. There was a quiet twist hidden in those long evenings over memoranda. The teacher unknowingly training the man who would one day help push him aside. For now, though, Gaitskell was entirely the pupil, Dalton entirely the master. The older Hugh's rivalry was still focused elsewhere, on Cripps, whose austere socialism and personal integrity were winning him a following that sometimes outshone Dalton's own reputation. As 1945 approached, the war in Europe neared its end, and another, more personal countdown accelerated. An election could not be put off forever. When it came, the country would have to choose: continue under Churchill, the war hero and conservative, or turn to Attlee's Labour Party with its promise of reconstruction. Attlee would have to choose, in turn, who would hold the great offices of state. One chancellor, two obvious candidates from Labour's left, Cripps and Dalton. Hugh knew his age. He would be 58 in August 1945. This was his moment. Miss it, and there would not be another. Younger men like Gaitskell were already rising behind him. The party's patience for those who had first taken office in the 1920s was limited. The Labour Manifesto, Let Us Face the Future, bore the imprint of his committees and his pen. National insurance, national health, full employment policy, public ownership of fuel and power. Much of the economic skeleton was his. He campaigned across the country not as a theoretician now, but as a minister who had kept industry running under bombs and believed he could keep it running in peace. On 26th of July 1945, the results came like aftershocks. Seat after seat turned red. Safe Tory shires fell. Men who had served under Churchill for years found themselves suddenly ousted by unknown Labour candidates. It was not just a victory, it was a landslide. Britain, exhausted and rationed, had placed its future in the hands of Attlee's team. Hugh held Bishop Auckland comfortably. That had never been the real suspense. The real question came a few days later, in a quiet room, when Clement Attlee began to summon colleagues to offer, or withhold, the great offices. Cripps was respected, admired, but also distrusted by some as too rigid, too left, too willing to split. Dalton, for all his sharp tongue, had worked loyally within the party machine and the coalition. He had won Attlee's trust not with heroic gestures but with competence and stamina. When the call came, he went to number 10 with a composure that hid the pounding in his chest. Attlee, characteristically dry, did not build up to it with flowery speeches. He simply told him, "You will be Chancellor of the Exchequer." The job he had studied for since Cambridge, the office he had watched from the back benches, the red box he had imagined lifting, while still in LSE lecture halls, All of it was now, finally, his. He walked across to the Treasury, the great stone building staring down Whitehall like a fortress. Civil servants lined the corridors, some curious, some wary. He knew they had served chancellors who believed their job was to keep things as they were. He intended to use the levers of finance to transform the country instead. Somewhere inside, a clock chimed the quarter hour. He had won the longest race of his life, against the class that had raised him, against the orthodoxy that had defined British economics, against rivals in his own party, against time itself. What he did not yet know was how quickly, and how carelessly, he would later gamble all that hard-won power on a single whispered sentence. He had waited 20 years for the red box. No one told him it would feel like lifting a live grenade. On his first morning as Chancellor of the Exchequer, Hugh Dalton sat alone in the Treasury office, the door closed, the silence thick. Outside, Whitehall teemed with clerks and messengers. Inside, on his desk, lay the symbol of power he had chased since his 20s. A scarred, dark red dispatch box. The word Chancellor, faintly visible beneath layers of polish and history. He clicked it open. Inside were not dreams but ledgers. Not ideals, but deficits. Page after page of figures that looked almost obscene in their scale. Britain, the proud imperial power of his childhood, was technically victorious and practically broke. Overseas debts stretching across continents. Gold reserves thinned to a whisper. Dollar holdings smaller than some American corporations. It was like inheriting a mansion and then discovering the foundations were riddled with rot. Yet outside that window, millions of people believed the opposite was about to happen. They had voted for labor not just to stabilize the ruins, but to build a new world on them. A welfare state, full employment, new houses, free medicine, fairness written into the tax code instead of charity handed out at the factory gate. And in the middle of that impossible triangle, war debt, popular expectation, hostile markets, sat Hugh Dalton, 58, pipe in hand, a lifetime's theory suddenly having to become practice, fast. There was another complication. The man he had beaten to the chancellorship had not disappeared. Stafford Cripps, that austere, almost monk-like figure with the voice of a barrister and the moral gravity of a preacher, now occupied the Board of Trade. If Dalton's office controlled the money, Cripps's department controlled production, exports, and the lifeblood of the recovery. Two labor intellectuals, two wartime heavyweights, one economy on the edge, and a clock ticking loudly in both their ears. "How long do we have?" Dalton asked his senior officials in one of his first briefings. "Before the dollars run out." 2, perhaps 3 years, one replied carefully. "If we are prudent." Prudent? It was the word the old Treasury had used for a century to smother every reformer it disliked. He looked at them over his glasses. "We are not going to balance the books on empty stomachs," he said. "We are going to balance them on full employment." The mandarins shifted in their chairs. This was not how sound finance was supposed to sound. But the clock was real. The United States had given Britain a huge loan with tight conditions attached. Within a set period, sterling would have to be made convertible, freely exchangeable for dollars. If, when that day came, the British economy was weak, foreign holders of sterling could strip the country of dollars in a brutal rush, build too slowly, and the people who had borne 6 years of war would lose patience. Build too fast, and the City of London, Wall Street, and the foreign exchange markets might decide the new chancellor was a danger to capitalist civilization. He did what he had always done when faced with a giant, unsolvable problem. He began to redraw the map. His first budget, in late 1945, was not a cautious step but a controlled explosion. He raised taxes on high incomes and large inheritances until some in the press screamed that he was punishing success. He tightened duties on luxury goods, furs, champagne, expensive cars, anything that symbolized to ordinary voters the old world of unearned privilege. At the same time, he eased the burden on the people who had nothing left to squeeze. He broadened family allowances, backed the foundation of a comprehensive social insurance system, paved the financial way for the National Health Service that Enron Bevan would soon fight to create. His cheap money policy kept interest rates low, so the government could borrow without drowning in interest. In phrases honed over decades, he sold the budget not as dry arithmetic, but as moral redress. The days when the poor were asked to tighten their belts so that the rich might loosen theirs, he told the Commons, are over. On the Tory benches, faces stiffened. On Labour's side, men and women who had grown up in streets where unemployment was a family tradition felt, perhaps for the first time, that the logic of the system itself was being tilted in their favor, he walked out of the chamber that night to a flurry of congratulations. But the loudest sound in his head was not applause. It was that quiet, remorseless ticking. Rationing, introduced in wartime, not only stayed, in some areas it deepened. Bread, symbol of basic security, joined the list in 1946. To opponents, this was proof that labor was mismanaging prosperity into penury. To Dalton, it was the exact opposite. The only way to make sure everyone, not just the quick and the rich, got enough to survive while the nation redirected resources into rebuilding. He received letters from housewives written in shaky ink, complaints about thin stews, praise for fair shares, fury about shortages of nylons and sweets. He had one notice pinned in his mind above his desk. They did not fight Hitler to go back to the 30s. Every time he opened the budget papers, that sentence stared back at him, invisible to everyone else. Across Whitehall, Cripps watched all this with a mix of admiration and concern. He agreed with Dalton's ends. A more equal Britain, a planned economy, industries run for public good rather than private profit. But where Dalton's socialism was expansive, almost exuberant, Cripps's was ascetic. He believed in self-denial, steel discipline, a nation almost puritanical in its willingness to forego comforts today for security tomorrow. At dinners and cabinet committees, the contrast between them was almost theatrical. Dalton, with his dry jokes, his occasional malicious aside, his love of gossip and wine. Cripps, tall and thin, often ill, speaking in grave, measured sentences about the need for sacrifice, about the danger of inflation, about the moral duty to export more than Britain imported. Both men knew that only one economic philosophy would, in the end, define the government. And outside both their windows, the world was moving faster than any domestic timetable. India, the jewel of the empire, was on the brink of partition and independence, with all the bloodshed and financial loss that entailed. Europe lay in ruins, desperate for coal, steel, machinery, everything Britain could barely produce for itself. The Americans, wary of funding what some of them called British socialism, pressed for trade liberalization and currency convertibility on a fixed schedule. In 1946, Dalton traveled to Washington to help nail down the terms of Britain's financial rescue. The Great American Loan that, on paper, saved the country from collapse, and in practice wrapped a time bomb around his chair at the Treasury. He stood under the marble columns of American departments and argued, calmly and firmly, that a nation that had spent 6 years holding off Hitler for the democratic world might reasonably expect help without humiliation. Some in Congress nodded. Others muttered about Britain wanting something for nothing. The final agreement was a compromise that satisfied no one completely. Britain would receive the loan, but within a set period, it would also have to make sterling freely convertible. The clock, once abstract, now had a date stamped on it. Back in London as he signed the documents, Dalton felt the paradox press in. Every hospital built, every slum cleared, every new factory loaned government money would increase the pressure on the very economic system that had to withstand the shock of convertibility. Every step toward the society he believed in would give his enemies more ammunition to claim he was bankrupting the nation. Inside cabinet, the whispering began. Some said he was too political for the Treasury, too eager to please Labor Conference, not careful enough of overseas confidence. Others, mostly on the left, murmured that he was still too cautious, that he had not gone far enough in nationalizing the banks, that he was letting the old ruling class survive under new paperwork. He responded with work. He drove through the nationalization of the Bank of England, pulling the mysterious, privately controlled heart of the financial system under public control. He supported the coal board's creation, bringing the pits where he had campaigned in Durham in the 30s into state hands. Electricity, civil aviation, cable and wireless communications. He watched, sometimes from the front, sometimes from the wings, as chunks of the old private economy were absorbed into what he had once only sketched in pamphlets. The Britain of 1947 was not yet socialist, but it was no longer quite capitalist in the way his father's generation would have recognized, and still the numbers on his treasury reports refused to behave. The winter of 1947 seemed almost personally vindictive. Britain froze. Snow piled in monstrous drifts across the north. Coal wagons stalled. Power stations ground to a halt. In city after city, lights went out. Factories stopped. For 6 weeks, newspapers shrank to a few thin pages. Radio went silent for hours each day. People burned furniture when coal ran out. The cartoonists had a feast. Tight-faced housewives in overcoats, shivering under portraits of Attlee and Dalton. "Is this the brave new world?" Captions sneered. For Dalton, it was worse than a public relations disaster. Every ton of coal not delivered meant fewer exports. Fewer exports meant fewer dollars earned. Fewer dollars meant less ability to face the looming day when sterling would have to be thrown into the international markets and told, "Swim." In those weeks, he could feel authority leaking away like heat from the drafty rooms of Whitehall. Critics who had always disliked him now had concrete failures to point at. The right blamed nationalization and socialist interference. Some in Labour's own ranks began to murmur that perhaps he had tried to do too much too quickly with too little margin. Clement Attlee, patient as ever, did not panic. But he did what good generals do when a campaign gets bogged down. He rearranged his staff. In the summer of 1947, he created a new role, Minister for Economic Affairs, with overarching responsibility for coordination and planning. It was, on paper, a position designed to support the Chancellor in the colossal task of rebuilding a ruined economy. He offered it to Stafford Cripps. Dalton understood immediately what that meant. For the public, there would now be two economic voices, two faces associated with austerity and reconstruction. For the press in the city, there was a new comparison to make: Dalton's budgets versus Cripps's plans. For the party, there was a new candidate visibly being tested at the highest level. The rivalry that had once been just a tension between different styles of socialism now hardened into something closer to a duel, even if no one involved was crude enough to say so out loud. In meetings of the Economic Committee, Dalton would argue for sustaining consumption, keeping working-class living standards from falling, trusting that higher employment and demand would in time fix the balance of payments. Cripps, gaunt and implacable, would push for stricter controls, higher savings, a national campaign of self-denial to pay for investment and exports. The arguments were technical, but the stakes were human. Dalton would picture the miners' family in Bishop Auckland, staring at one more poster telling them to save for victory, when all they wanted was a bit more meat. Cripps would picture the same family, only this time in 10 years' time if inflation ran away and the currency collapsed. Wages worthless, savings destroyed, factories down again. Behind both visions was the same dread: a return to the 1930s. But to avoid it, one man emphasized spending, the other sacrifice. And time for theoretical debate was running out. In July 1947, under the terms of the American agreement, sterling was made convertible. It was as if someone had opened a sluice gate at a dam that had been shuddering with pressure for years. Within days, the drain began. Foreign holders of sterling, nervous, unconvinced by Britain's prospects, hungry for dollars, began to cash in. The flow turned to a flood. The Bank of England's dollar reserves sank like a stone. In the Treasury, daily reports came in with numbers that made Dalton's stomach twist. This was the nightmare that critics had warned of, unfolding in real time. After 6 weeks facing the prospect of running entirely out of dollars, the government slammed the sluice gate shut again. Convertibility was suspended. The international obligations Britain had promised to honor were, bluntly, set aside. It was, in cold economic terms, the least bad of several bad options. But in political terms, it was a humiliation. The city muttered about incompetence. In Washington, some shook their heads and spoke of old habits in British policy. At home, the sense grew that the people at the top of the economic machine were not fully in control of it. In the public mind, blame for the fiasco did not spread equally. It settled, with the slow, heavy logic of media storytelling, on the man with the red box. Dalton could feel it in the way questions were asked in the Commons, in the sharpness of editorials, in the coolness of smiles at official receptions. Even in the glances of junior officials, there was, now and then, that flicker which says, "Is he still going to be here in a year?" He fought back in the way he knew best, with another budget. The 1947 budget would, he decided, prove that he still commanded events. He would show that Britain could steady itself after the convertibility storm, that careful adjustments could bring inflation under control without smashing living standards, that the path between Scylla and Charybdis, between ruinous austerity and reckless spending, still existed. He spent weeks over it. The figures were checked and rechecked. He planned, as always, to lace the dry recitation with moral argument, to remind the Commons that the war's victory had been collective, and so must be the sacrifice. He worked on jokes, on barbs, on a line or two that would make even the Tory benches laugh in spite of themselves. He also fatally kept up his old habit of talking. Hugh Dalton had always been a gossip. He loved the dance of politics, the hints, the shared confidences, the sense of being at the center of a web of information that others found thrilling to touch. He had for years cultivated journalists, feeding them fragments and angles in return for sympathetic coverage of his ideas. Most of the time, it was harmless. Sometimes it was useful. On the morning of 12th November 1947, as he walked through the corridors of the Commons towards the chamber where he would deliver his make-or-break budget, a young reporter from the Evening Standard fell into step beside him. They talked, casually, cheerfully, about the speech to come, about what people could expect. In a few careless phrases, almost a courtesy, almost a boast, the Chancellor of the Exchequer told a journalist, minutes before, rising in the House, some of the key measures he was about to announce. Small tax changes, details he thought trivial enough not to matter, interesting enough to be an exclusive. He did not, at that instant, feel the clock. He did not see the invisible line he had just crossed between the old, clubby world of inside information and the newer, harsher standard of public probity that would define the post-war era. To him, it was another small dance step in a routine he had been performing for decades. The reporter ran back to his office. The presses rolled. As Dalton stood at the dispatch box that afternoon and began his solemn incantation, "I beg to move that it is expedient to amend the law with respect to the national debt, customs, and inland revenue." Copies of the Evening Standard were already being hawked. On the streets of London, headlines revealing measures no one outside the Treasury was meant to know until that very moment. At first, almost no one in the chamber realized what had happened. Then, whispers began. An opposition MP waved a newspaper. Faces turned. On the government benches, eyes narrowed. On the tables of the city, astonishment spread. In Attlee's office, the implications assembled themselves with frightening speed. Budget secrecy was not a trivial convention. It was the wall that prevented speculators from profiting off advanced knowledge, that protected the integrity of markets, that guaranteed fairness between those in the know and those in the dark. A breach of that wall by the Chancellor himself was not a faux pas. It was a sin. That evening, in a small, intense meeting in Downing Street, Dalton faced the Prime Minister he respected more than any other man in politics. Attlee, as usual, did not shout. He listened to the explanation, the hurried, almost incredulous account of the accidental leak, the insistence that the measures revealed were minor, that no great harm had been done. Then he looked at the man who had carried so much of Labour's economic program in his head and hands. Hugh knew, before the words were spoken, what had to come. He offered his resignation. Attlee accepted. The next morning, the papers that had recently mocked Dalton for shortages and crises now printed his political obituary. The budget he had hoped would reassert his authority had instead killed his career at the Treasury before most of its measures even took effect. Within days, Stafford Cripps was appointed Chancellor. Hugh watched the news unfold with a kind of stunned clarity. The office he had chased since his youth, held for barely 2 years, had slipped from his grasp not in a titanic ideological showdown, not in a grand betrayal, but in a brief, thoughtless conversation in a corridor. In the Treasury, the red box was passed to another pair of hands. In Whitehall, civil servants adjusted seamlessly, turning from Chancellor Dalton to Chancellor Cripps with the professional smoothness of men used to regimes rising and falling. For Dalton, the ticking of the clock changed sound. It no longer counted down to the next budget, the next crisis in the foreign exchanges, the next international negotiation. It beat in a more intimate rhythm now. The time left to salvage a role, a reputation, a legacy in a government he had helped design, but no longer helped to steer. He walked out of the Treasury for the last time as Chancellor, the weight in his hand no longer a red box, but something colder and heavier. The knowledge that, after a lifetime spent fighting his way to the nerve center of power, he had been flung back to the margins by a few reckless words. And even as he left, another, younger man, the Hugh he had once mentored at the Board of Trade, Hugh Gateskull, was already starting to move inside the new economic order, first under Cripps, then beyond. The race did not end when he stumbled. It simply went on without him. He discovered very quickly what power sounded like when it belonged to someone else. In the winter after his resignation, Hugh Dalton sat on the Labour front bench and listened, while Stafford Cripps, gaunt and precise, he delivered the next great economic statement to the House of Commons. The same green benches, the same red dispatch box, the same ritual phrases that he had once spoken like spells. Only now, when Cripps said, "I propose," the markets moved. When Dalton spoke, the House shifted, politely, and then forgot. There was a cruel intimacy to it. The man who had written much of Labor's economic catechism was reduced to annotating another priest's sermon. Outside Westminster, the story had already hardened. In editorials and cartoons, Dalton was the man who had talked himself out of the Treasury. Cripps was the sober surgeon brought in to clean up the mess. The fact that much of what Cripps did followed the path Dalton had already traced. Tight controls, long-term planning, continued. Rationing did not matter. History, once it chooses a face for an era, is slow to replace it. Inside, the clock kept moving. He was 60. Any talk of next time carried the quiet cruelty of arithmetic. General elections, cabinets, careers, they all took years. He did not have endless years left. Clement Attlee understood both the politics and the man. He did not want his former chancellor wandering the backbenches as a wounded grandee, feeding journalists with resentments. Nor did he want to throw overboard a comrade who had been at his side since the days when Labour could fit its entire parliamentary party into a single awkward group photograph. So in 1948, Attlee brought him back into the cabinet as Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster, an ancient-sounding title with no great department attached, a kind of political holding pen. It was a strange half-life. He attended cabinet, read the same memoranda, argued the same big questions about NATO, colonial independence, German reconstruction, but there were no vast spending programs with his signature on them now. No budgets with his name stamped across the front pages. His office was small, his staff modest. Important papers passed across his desk like aircraft that had already been cleared to land somewhere else. To a man who had once controlled the entire fiscal weather of the nation, it felt like serving as a meteorologist after you had been demoted from God. The rivalry with Cripps, paradoxically, softened and sharpened at the same time. On some days, watching the new chancellor wear himself out in the furnace of austerity, Dalton felt a stab of sympathy that he would not have admitted to anyone. Cripps was ill, overworked, fighting the same implacable external limits, dollars, coal, export targets, that had hemmed in Dalton's time at the Treasury. When Cripps insisted on more controls, more sacrifice, Dalton could not simply denounce him without denouncing his own deeply held belief in planning. On other days, as praise for Crippsian discipline filled the papers, he felt the older pang of rivalry twist harder. The very wage restraint and rationing that had earned Dalton the reputation of a bungler now acquired, in Cripps's hands, an almost moral glamour. Austerity, preached in that grave, ascetic voice, sounded like virtue, and always, beneath personal feelings, lay the ticking of a different sort of clock. The government's majority was shrinking. By-elections chipped away at Labour's dominance. The heroic afterglow of 1945 was fading into the grumbling fatigue of everyday shortages and queues. The next general election, that blunt, impersonal judgment, loomed closer with every month of coal deliveries and bacon rations. Dalton knew, if Labour lost, his chance of ever holding real office again would shrink from slim to microscopic. No one brought a 70-year-old back as chancellor. This parliament, this cabinet, this handful of years, that was his remaining battlefield. He needed a new front. He found it in bricks and maps. After the narrow Labour victory of February 1950, Attlee reshuffled his team. Cripps moved to a super-ministry of economic affairs. Then, soon afterwards, exhausted, began his long retreat from politics and life. Hugh Gaitskell, the younger Hugh Dalton had once nudged forward at the Board of Trade, rose at astonishing speed to become chancellor. The office that had eluded him for so long now occupied by a man almost 20 years his junior, and Dalton himself was made Minister of Local Government and Planning. On paper, it sounded like exile to the provinces. In reality, it was a hidden lever of power over how Britain would look, feel, and live for generations. His new department dealt in the raw physical aftermath of war. Bomb sites and slums, the pent-up demand of families who had spent 10 years crammed into damp rooms under leaking roofs. It held responsibility for new towns, those strange, optimistic experiments in building communities from scratch, and for the astonishing idea of a green belt that would wrap around London and other cities like a deliberate restraint on the old, anarchic sprawl of capitalism. The glamour of currency crises was gone. In its place were planning applications, drainage issues, squabbles between county councils. Many Westminster journalists barely glanced at the circulars emerging from his ministry. But if the Treasury decided how money flowed, planning decided where it stopped and hardened into streets. Dalton threw himself into it with the zeal of a man who understood he was leaving fingerprints on the future. He toured sites where towns were, at that moment, nothing more than fields scoured by wind and the occasional bulldozer. In Stevenage, Harlow, Peterlee, he stood amid mud and scaffolding, looking at architects' models that promised shops, schools, civic squares, indoor plumbing, clean air, a working-class life that did not involve soot and rats as standard features. "Do you understand," he would tell local dignitaries, "that in a few years children will grow up here thinking this is normal?" In Whitehall, maps in his office were pricked with pins and thick with penciled boundaries. The Greenbelt, a notion that had started as a line on a policy paper, became something almost visceral to him. A ring of land that must not be surrendered to the pressures of developers and short-term profits. While others laughed that it was easy for a man from Durham to worry about preserving fields around London, he held the line. If he could no longer control the nation's wallet, he could, at least, help shape its landscape. Yet even in this new domain, the old rivalry reappeared, in a different form. Gaitskell, as Chancellor, now sat where he had once sat. There was no malice in their exchanges. They lunched, they joked, they reminisced about the days when Hugh the Elder had been mentor and patron. But beneath the affability was the unspoken recognition that only one of their names would, in the end, be attached to the great post-war settlement. Dalton had used the Treasury to fund the beginnings of the welfare state. Gaitskell was now tasked with paying for its continuation, under far harsher constraints. When rows erupted over charges for dentures and spectacles in the NHS, when Aneurin Bevan thundered about betrayal and resigned, it was Gaitskell who took the blows in the Commons. And, crucially, Gaitskell who gained the reputation of the responsible man of the centre. To the press, the economic story of labor now had a fresh protagonist. Dalton, watching from local government and planning, felt himself shifting from actor to reference point. The man people cited either as a warning or a precedent. Time, meanwhile, refused to slow. The Korean War exploded onto the front pages in 1950, dragging Britain into another vast, expensive conflict just as it was trying to pay for peace. Rearmament collided with welfare spending like two trains on the same line. In cabinet, Dalton watched hour-of-control numbers reappear in Treasury papers, now bearing Gaitskell's annotations rather than his own. He sensed another deadline forming. The government's tiny majority, battered by defections and defeats, made holding on until 1955 impossible. A new general election would have to come, and soon. And if Labour lost, the planning schemes he was pushing through, the new towns, the protections, the hard-won provisions for council, housing, could be slowed, diluted, or stopped altogether by a conservative government more interested in market forces than municipal vision. So he worked as if packing a suitcase before a train left. Regulations were signed, designations confirmed, funds allocated. He argued with civil servants who urged delay, snarled at colleagues who treated planning documents as dull paperwork rather than blueprints for lives. Every approval stamp felt like a small act of defiance against the oncoming tide. In October 1951, the tide arrived. Labour won more votes than the Conservatives but fewer seats. Churchill returned to Downing Street. Hugh Dalton left his ministerial office for the last time. The files stacked in neat, impersonal piles for his Tory successor. On the staircase, he paused and looked back. He had entered national office for the first time in 1929 as a junior minister in a doomed government. He now left it, 22 years later, surrounded by a Britain immeasurably transformed from the one of his youth, yet out of power, again. There would be no third act in cabinet. From the opposition benches, he watched Gaitskell and others fight over the remnants of the Attlee settlement. The Conservatives, wary of smashing a system that seemed popular and broadly functional, left much of it standing. The National Health Service survived. Family allowances remained. The nationalized industries stayed in public hands. The post-war consensus that historians would later name did not bear one man's signature. It was a mosaic of decisions, some taken under his watch, others after. But for Dalton, something more intimate was at stake. His central rival now was not Cripps, already dying, but Gaitskell, younger, smoother, apparently tireless, moving towards the leadership of a party that Dalton had once imagined in a private hour he might himself lead. The question of who had really made labor's economic soul was no longer being contested in cabinet minutes. It was being fought, subtly and brutally, in memoirs, conference speeches, whispers in constituency parties. He aligned, more often than not, with the leadership against the fiery Bevonites on the left. The man who had once been denounced as a dangerous radical now defended responsible policy against those who wanted to push further, faster, towards socialism. It was an irony he was perfectly aware of, and not entirely comfortable with. Perhaps the most painful realization of those years was that time eroded not just enemies, but also the causes for which he had been most willing to bleed. The League of Nations, for which he had fought almost obsessively in the 1920s and 1930s, was dead, replaced by the United Nations. The Commonwealth was turning from empire into something looser, less easily defined. Even the coalfields of County Durham, the backdrop of his most passionate early campaigns, were changing beneath nationalization and mechanization into something his younger self would barely have recognized. On foreign policy, he found renewed moral purpose in attacking Anthony Eden's Suez Adventure in 1956. The idea that Britain, without parliamentary clarity or international law on its side, could secretly collude with France and Israel to seize back the canal from Egypt, enraged everything in him that had once believed the First World War was the war to end war. Standing in the Commons, older, heavier, but with his voice still capable of a cutting edge, he denounced the operation as folly. In that moment, he was again the tribune of a different Britain, the Britain of law, treaties, collective security. But Suez, for all its drama, did not restore him to centrality. It damaged the conservatives. It shook the country's faith in imperial illusions. It contributed to the sense that a new, post-imperial Britain would have to be invented. Others, Harold Macmillan, then Harold Wilson, then eventually a whole generation born after the Somme, would claim the task. By 1959, the clock that had once counted down budgets now counted something blunter. He was 71. After nearly 40 years in the House of Commons, he stepped down as MP for Bishop Auckland. The constituency that had written to him in thousands about rationing and coal shortages now sent him farewell gifts and polite formal thanks. In labor circles, his name still carried weight. On the doorsteps, it was fading. Yet one more twist remained. In 1960, he was raised to the peerage as Baron Dalton, of Forest and Frith in the county of Durham. The boy who had once watched bewigged lords from the Commons gallery, scowling at their complacent immortality, now found himself entering their house in Erminy. The symbolism was complicated, and he knew it. Some on the left muttered about betrayal. Others shrugged it off as a harmless accolade for long service. For Dalton, it offered two things he valued: a seat, however modest, in the legislature, and, perhaps more importantly, time. Time to write. He had kept diaries on and off since the First World War, scrawled entries about battles and committees, notes on cabinet rows, savage one-line portraits of colleagues, records of who had said what in rooms where no journalist ever sat. Now, in a study piled with notebooks and papers, he began to turn those chaotic jottings into something more deliberate. He organized, cut, annotated. He drafted an autobiography, High Tide and After, trying to catch in prose not just what had happened, but what it had felt like to ride the swelling wave of labor's ascent and then be rolled under. He knew he was not a neutral witness. He had no intention of being one. This was his chance, perhaps his last, to fix his version of events before memory, his own and others, blurred the edges. There was a dark irony in it. Words had destroyed his career at the Treasury. A few casual phrases in a corridor had breached budget secrecy and toppled him from power. But words, carefully preserved, might yet rescue his place in history. The same impulse that had driven him to gossip, the desire to record, to share, to shape the narrative, now worked in a controlled, patient way. In committees of the Lords, he spoke less frequently than he once had in the Commons, husbanding his strength. When he did contribute, it was often on issues that had obsessed him his whole life: economic planning, international cooperation, the moral obligations of great powers. But the true audience he imagined as he wrote was not the red benches or the press gallery. It was a future generation of historians, politicians, citizens who would one day ask, how did that extraordinary moment after 1945 really happen? He could feel, physically, that the clock was almost out. Illness crept in. Days at the desk grew shorter. Friends and rivals from his youth disappeared one by one from the newspaper's parliamentary columns and reappeared briefly, in the obituaries. Stafford Cripps had died in 1952, Aneurin Bevan in 1960, Clement Attlee, the quiet general of their greatest victory, in 1967, outliving him, but already half withdrawn from public life as Dalton himself declined. On 13th of February 1962, Hugh Dalton died in London, aged 74. There was no state funeral, no crowds lining the streets. The obituaries were respectful, tinged with that particular British mixture of admiration and faint condescension reserved for men who had aimed high, fallen conspicuously, and yet left something solid behind them. They mentioned the budget leak, of course, as if a single careless conversation could neatly stand in for all the compromises and collisions of a life in politics. They mentioned the Bank of England's nationalization, the taxes on wealth, the role he had played in the early planning of the welfare state. Some noted the new towns and the Greenbelt. Fewer understood how much of their daily landscape bore his fingerprints. The red dispatch box was in other hands now. The battles over austerity and spending had moved on to other chancellors, other rivalries. The clock he had listened to so intently had not stopped. It had merely changed rooms. And yet, in cabinets and archives, in boxes that looked ironically like smaller, dustier versions of the one that had once symbolized his power, his diaries and papers waited. When they began to be published and mined, years later, historians found not only a record of meetings and policies, but the interior monologue of a man standing at the fulcrum between an old ruling class and a new order built in its shadow. They found acid sketches of Churchill and Attlee, of Cripps and Bevan and Gaitskell. They found, above all, the fierce conviction that had driven him from his father's vicarage to the Treasury and beyond. The belief that the economy was not a natural phenomenon but a human instrument, and that it could be bent, however imperfectly, towards justice. Rivalries faded, debts were paid, fashions in socialism and capitalism rose and fell. But each time a British government, of whatever party, accepted that full employment was a legitimate aim of policy, or that the state had a duty to provide basic welfare, or that planning the physical shape of towns was not merely a private matter, a faint echo of his voice sounded. Hugh Dalton never again held the red box after that night in 1947. His last budgets were not his most lasting work. What survived of him was more diffuse, harder to headline, but in some ways more decisive. A set of assumptions, built into the foundations, of post-war Britain, about what a decent society owed its people. The race had gone on without him. But the track it ran on was still, in places, the one he had helped lay.